Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest. But before I tell you who it is, let me tell you first that this is going to be my Don't Mention the War special edition. Why is that? I tell you why. Because my guest is German, and it would be very insensitive to bring up the events of 1939 to 1945, or 1914-1918, or indeed the World Cup of 1966. So I'm not going to mention any of that stuff.
Let's talk about World Cups while we're at this.
No, actually, let's not. I said we weren't going to, Kristian.
All right.
My very special guest is none other than Kristian Niemitz of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is kind of my resource, my guest resource, because the IEA, which is based in London, is incredibly sound and full of incredibly sound people. And Kristian is one of them. Kristian, what's actually your job there?
It's technically head of health and welfare, but as always, we're a small think tank. It means you're a generalist, you're writing about everything under the sun.
Yeah.
So Western civilization, everything that's wrong with the world, as long as it's somehow economics related.
Yeah, because I'm very impressed the way that you chaps and chapesses, you all seem to have economics degrees, and you all seem to be clued up about Mises and Hayek and all the heroes, yeah?
Yes, true.
Yeah.
That's the backbone. I mean, Hayek was, in a way, the spiritual founder of the Institute. He wasn't involved with setting it up as an organization, but he gave the inspiration. The guy who did set it up went to the LSE, where Hayek was teaching at the time, and sought advice from him. And Hayek, in a sense, said to him, you need to reach the intellectuals, you need to try to change the climate of opinion in the country. And sort of that was the bare bones of the ideas for an institute of this kind.
One of the things that I don't want to get bogged down in economics, particularly because it might confuse our beloved sweet listener, because we have a special friend listening to this, and our special friend, I think our special friend likes the kind of the banter a bit, doesn't want too much heaviosity, but nevertheless, maybe you can answer something that really puzzles me, which is how come our politicians, and particularly conservative politicians, are so economically illiterate? It's like they don't care about basic stuff. Like, for example, I know from reading Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, who's one of my heroes, that if you introduce a minimum wage, the people that hurts most are the poor. It's like a tax on jobs, isn't it? I mean, this is just basic economics.
Yes, that's Econ 101. There is a type of conservative who's almost proud of not knowing much about Econ 101, who takes pride in being non-ideological and muddling through with the situation, with the constraints as they find them, and try not to get too much involved with the broader climate of ideas. They don't try to change the political culture, but try to accept the political constraints they find as given and somehow make the best of it.
Yes, politics is the art of the possible, they think, and they pride themselves on that. It's like a game for them, isn't it? It's not about right or wrong. It's about what you can do, what you can get away with.
Which is fine in a specific situation. I can see why during an election campaign you wouldn't want to start a fundamental debate about political philosophy and try to change the country in a completely different direction. But, we're not in an election campaign now. We're in normal times, and we're unconstrained, actually.
But in the old days, in the good old days, going back to Hayek a moment, there was that glorious incident, wasn't there, where Margaret Thatcher banged Hayek's Road to Serfdom down on the table and said, "This is what we believe." Now, can you name me a single politician in the government right now who believes any of that stuff? And let me tell you, let me be indiscreet and tell you briefly about a conversation I had with my mate, one of my best mates, Michael Gove, the other day. And I was having a go at him as usual for not being quite sound enough. And I said, look, you and I are on the same side. We believe the same things, don't we? And he said, well, up to a point. He said, for example, on economics, I'm not as Austrian as you are. And I think that's basically saying that thing we were saying earlier about their rejection of Economics 101 and this kind of this perverse pride they have in not sort of following the basic conservative economic rules.
Yes, I guess you would have trouble finding a politician nowadays who would even, never mind Hayek or Friedman, who would even just say, yes, I am a Thatcherite. I remember in that Thatcher documentary when David Cameron was asked, are you a Thatcherite? When he started waffling and saying, oh, well, it was a specific situation, blah, blah, blah.
Bastard.
He couldn't just say, I am with some minor differences or whatever.
Yeah. What a tosser. Actually, what a tosser. Can I say, by the way, Kristian, this is the first time we've actually met and conversed in any detail. And I have to say, if I were going to be invading Russia in 1941, late 1941, I'd really want you commanding one of my panzer divisions. I like the way that you, when I ask you a question, you look at me and you consider what I'm saying and you answer it straight. Top man.
I don't know whether that makes you good at being the head of a panzer division, but yeah, that's normally the way I try to do things. Yeah.
You'd be decisive, mate. You'd be fantastic. This has brought me into a digression. How does it feel? I mean, I look at my country and I think it is a complete dog's breakfast at the moment. It's been royally screwed over. First of all, obviously by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and then latterly by continuation Blair, which is David Cameron, and now this dismal Theresa May. But then I look at your country, and I think, what must it be like to be a sort of conservative, free market leaning German who believes in Western civilization and borders and stuff and national identity? How do you feel as a German about what's happened?
Well, that political climate over there is one of the reasons why I've stayed here. It's easier to live here if you're a libertarian, because Germany is generally a very left-wing country. And
has been since when?
Ever since I can remember.
So before Hitler, because Hitler was
my
left-wing as
lifetimes.
well, wasn't he?
On the economics, you could say that, yes.
Yeah.
But I think it's more, what I'm talking about is specifically basically the same that happened here, but that was more decisive over there, which was the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and the left becoming, in cultural terms, the dominant force. And that has gone further over there. So as a libertarian, if you're with people who you don't know, you would shut up about politics. You would wait until they get to know you a bit better and notice that you're not a monster. Because if you just say something straight away, if you express a libertarian point of view straight away, people around you would freak out. And in that sense, it's more relaxed here for libertarian.
Yes, I went out to Berlin fairly recently to the international branch of the Taxpayers Alliance.
Yes.
To a sort of weekend, and I was one of the speakers, and it wasn't held at one of the big hotels, the grand hotels. It was sort of in a slight backwater of Berlin, and one really got the feeling that we were a kind of minority. We weren't the kind of the typical German crowd.
Well, that was Neukölln. I was there as well.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a bit of a special place. That used to be the Turkish borough, and it's now becoming gentrified. Now the hipsters are moving in.
Right.
But I still like Neukölln in a way. I don't think I would want to live there.
No.
But for a visit, it was fine for that conference weekend.
Yes, no, it was. It was good exploring Berlin. Although certain things made me very uneasy. I tell you what made me really uneasy. There was an afternoon where my wife and I went on the U-Bahn to go and visit the Jewish Museum,
Yep.
which is a magnificent building and fascinating design. You probably know it. You sort of, it's like going on the inside of a snail, and you sort of work your way up this spiral of exhibits, and it's beautifully done. But in order to get to this museum, you have to get off the U-Bahn, and you walk through a very markedly Turkish area of town, and you get it's not like being in Germany, it's not like being in Europe even. You get these Middle Eastern Turkish faces looking at you, Obviously, the language is Turkish or possibly Arabic. I mean, I'm not sure. But there was a sort of air of almost menace. I thought this was a slightly awkward place for the Jewish museum to be, and then I got to the outside. No, we're getting to the point where we almost expect terrorist attacks at any moment, and there was a fat, middle-aged German policeman with a handgun, and his sidekick who was female, and I thought, you guys are just going to get wiped out as soon as there's going to be an attack on this museum, as inevitably there's going to be at some stage.
Could be, although those places are generally fine. Those boroughs have been that way for quite a while, and they have problems with gang warfare, but...
So they're killing each other, that's good.
They keep it amongst themselves. Yeah. I lived close to one of those boroughs and went out in the Turkish areas as well at night. Never felt unsafe. It's a welcoming place. Yes, right. But you have parallel cultures, yes.
How often do you go back to Germany?
Like twice a year.
Right. And how do sort of middle-class Germans feel about all these aliens in their midst that have been imposed on them by Merkel?
Well, you wouldn't openly talk about it.
Right.
There are
Don't mention the immigrants.
Yeah, and I think that is going to be maybe the biggest problem. It's not so much the numbers themselves. There are previous examples of countries that have managed to absorb large numbers of newcomers. It's just that normally happens best when there is a certain social pressure to integrate as well, so that most of the new arrivals want to integrate, but there would also be some social nudging that there are expectations. If you come here, you have to make some effort to fit in, and that's what's absent now, because nobody would dare to say a word of criticism. So I remember there was a newspaper article a couple of weeks ago which was about some employment program for recent arrivals which was trying to prepare them for jobs in some way. And they had an extremely high dropout rate, that program. And all the media coverage was, the program has failed. It's our fault, we're failing these people. Yep. Rather than, well, apparently some of them aren't taking this very seriously, so maybe this needs a bit of a stick as well as a carrot. Something like, if you don't participate, you get your benefits cut or something.
You'd think, wouldn't you? I mean...
And this is the way it would probably have been covered if this had been a program for domestic, long-term unemployed people.
Yes.
Where you would be able to say it.
There's certainly, I've noticed this at... in some of Breitbart's reporting of incidents which just don't get... Incidents in Germany, which simply don't get reported in the German media. I mean, the obvious one was the Cologne Taharush rape phenomenon that New Year's Eve, when gangs of Muslims were allowed to run riot, and instead of admitting what had gone on, the authorities, the police and the media were complicit in covering it up, weren't they?
Yes, there was some of the policemen said afterwards, we did notice that there was something going on, but we were afraid of being called racists or something. And that's what creates a spiral that makes the problem worse. If this had been in a less politically correct place, not in Cologne, but say in Munich, where they still have this more old-fashioned idea that the job of the police is policing rather than diversity counseling, I think they would have taken care of the situation much quicker. And if you do that a couple of times, then it probably wouldn't occur again. So this is all something that can be managed with proper policing. This isn't about the number of arrivals or even having a relatively open border immigration policy, but you need to be prepared and able to deal with it in the right way.
It's interesting what you say about Munich. I was once, ages ago, when I went interrailing, so this would have been just before university, I think. I went to Munich for the beer festival, and I very much noticed the different characteristic of Bavaria, which is Munich's in Bavaria, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. But Bavarians are kind of Germany is not Germany, is it? Germany is an agglomeration of different states with very different characteristics. Sure. So does that mean that there are some states in Germany which are less impressed with what's going on than others, and where the resistance might take place?
I would imagine a place like Bavaria to be a bit more, I don't know if hostile, but certainly that you would get greater pressure to integrate and abide by the rules there.
Yeah.
And it will probably work better there in the long run for that reason.
How much? Okay, so you've got AfD, you've got a certain amount of resistance, but I mean, when is the backlash going to begin, or do you think we're going to reach the point where, for example, as is already happening in German schools, where they're taking pig off the menu in order to appease the incomers? I mean, one of the things you notice about Germany, in fact, most of Middle Europe, is people eat pig. Lots and lots of pig, lots and lots of sausage, don't they? I mean, sausage is the thing.
Yeah, which is great.
Which is great, and I love eating sausages in Germany. I remember when I went to Berlin for the first time before the wall came down, and I got taken to the park in the city and got given bratwurst with senf, I suppose it would have been, wouldn't it?
It would have been.
It would have been.
It still would be.
And jolly good it was too. And I worry about cultural things like that. That Germany's in danger of ceasing to be Germany and becoming something else.
Yeah, but even in those boroughs of Berlin that you talk about, you can still very easily get your bratwurst. That is not the issue.
Now?
Yes.
Yes, now you can. But what about in 20 years?
Yeah, but those boroughs have been that way for decades, since at least the 60s. I'm not that worried about that. I guess what will happen is a sort of pragmatic hypocrisy. You will get, for example, you mentioned the Cologne event.
Yeah.
A year afterwards, that was interesting. It could have happened again there, and there were gangs gathering in front of the central station in Cologne, but this time the police was ready. This time the police was prepared, so nothing happened. They quelled it very quickly. I don't think anyone would have been comfortable talking about this, but they will still devise a policing strategy behind closed doors. They may not go to the press and say, we will specifically look out for people of North African appearance and specifically police those, but they will do it nonetheless, whether they call it that or not. Of course, if there had been a press conference with the police saying we will have a very high police presence in front of the central station, and we will look out specifically for people who might engage in that kind of behavior, then there would have been a backlash. Then the press would have skewered them, saying the police is racist, blah blah. But just keep a low profile on it, but get on with the job, and in that way, I think the whole thing will be managed.
It will be better. You're halfway to answering my next question, which is, look, Germany. Back in the day, Germany was a pretty formidable military force, and you had not just your Wehrmacht and your Waffen-SS and stuff, but you also had domestic police, the Gestapo, etc., running every aspect of people's lives. In Germany, East Germany, you had the Stasi. So you have a tradition of kind of police ruthlessness. Are your police capable of reviving? I mean, no, I don't mean bring back the Gestapo. I mean, are they capable of not being complete pussies? Still, do you think?
They seem to have pulled it off in Cologne this year.
They do.
Seem to have worked. So the capacity still seems to be there.
Right. And what about your military? Because as I understand it, they're all sort of so overweight that now might be a good time for us to have our next war with you and have you in like.
Is the British Army in a better shape at the moment?
We're smaller. We're small, but we're perfectly formed, I think.
Right.
And we seem to be arranging it so that we have lots and lots of really quite extreme combat experience, don't we? With our delight in choosing unnecessary wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc.
Yeah. Well, then let's not have the rematch just now, but let's wait a couple more
years.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. You're listening to the James Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, my special German guest, and we haven't mentioned the war. We're not going to at all, ever, because it's insensitive. Kristian Niemitz. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Kristian Niemitz, who's a German, by the way, of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And I'm very excited to hear, in the interval, Kristian told me that he's writing a book about communists. And if you ask any young person about communism, there's one thing they know, and that is that the problem with communism is that it hasn't been tried properly yet.
It wasn't real socialism.
It wasn't real socialism. I mean, that's where they all came out for Jeremy Corbyn in their droves. I mean, before you answer this one, let me tell you what I think is the problem, part of the problem. Every kid in school knows about the Nazis and how evil they were. None of the kids seem to have been taught how correspondingly evil Stalin was, and Mao was, and Pol Pot was, and Enver Hoxha in Albania, and Erich Honecker. I mean, pretty much every communist regime it just sails right over Cuba, sails right over their heads, la 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 la, not listening. So how are you going to deal with this problem?
I don't think it's enough to just teach them about it, because they would then, the general response then would be, yeah, that could all be, that's all well and good, but that's not the kind of socialism that we want.
Yeah.
So it's more that if you mention one of those examples in the presence of a socialist, what they will do is they roll their eyes and say, come on, now you're just being silly. Nobody is talking about recreating Stalinism or Maoism. All we want is a nicer, fairer society. The problem is just that if you ask them, right, then what exactly would you do differently? Imagine you had been in charge of the Soviet Union, or imagine you had been in charge of Maoist China. What exactly would you have changed? That's when they start to struggle and start to evade by talking about abstract ambitions, lofty ambitions, saying things like, oh, it would mean a society in which ordinary workers are in charge, in which the people run the economy, stuff like that. Those are abstract ambitions.
Worker representatives on the board of every company.
Who
would propose it? But who would propose that? What kind of nutcase? Oh wait, it was in the last Conservative manifesto.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with Corbyn mania, that of course parties of the right and centre right would feel obliged to mimic that behavior in some way, because they see, oh, this is the trendy thing to do now. But yeah, the issue is really that socialists have been very good at distancing themselves from past examples of socialism.
Yeah.
So
well, I see you had a piece out today. I read it in the cab on the way here in the heavy traffic, which actually made me very angry. I think London is complete toilet these days. Seamus Milne, Jeremy Corbyn's advisor, who was educated at one of the best private schools in the land, Winchester, whose pupils are supposed to be really punch above the nation's intellectual weight. And here was a guy justifying East Germany and saying actually most Germans miss the days of the DDR. And this guy he gets a mouthpiece and he gets to write in The Guardian, he gets to advise Jeremy Corbyn. There's a possibility that this guy could one day be the chief advisor of our Prime Minister.
Indeed. And although, to be fair to him, the thing about what makes him a bit special is that at least he doesn't use this excuse of that wasn't real socialism. He openly defends real existing socialism as it was in the USSR, in the GDR and other examples, at least he doesn't pull off the usual excuse, saying, oh no, that's got nothing to do with what we want real socialism, democratic socialism. He doesn't. He openly defends socialism that actually existed. That's what makes him special. And it's just so he's totally wrong, of course.
And he even looks at Venezuela and thinks that this is a kind of great model.
Yeah, that I have to say they all did. Until a couple of years ago, Owen Jones went on a pilgrimage to Caracas and wrote several articles about it afterwards, saying this is absolutely wonderful. They've abolished poverty. This is the future. We should be like that. And a lot of prominent trade unionists did the same thing. I'm looking up old quotes at the moment for the comic book that I'm writing. Yeah. The Venezuela section is a bit tricky because a lot of them are now deleting their old articles.
Oh, so, are they? Going down the memory hole.
Yeah, I have to. Yeah, although when Orwell wrote about a memory hole, they didn't have the Wayback Machine yet, which is this machine that stores deleted internet content. So,
but you've got to admit, these Stalinists are very good at airbrushing history. So
they have a tradition and they stick to it.
Kristian, how do you explain? Because I tend to write from first principles, and I tend to look at evidence. I mean, people on the left think of me as a kind of evil right-wing shill in the pay of big evil. But actually, if the facts change, I move with the times. I wouldn't want to defend a position which is indefensible. How do you explain the cognitive dissonance of the left? Why is Owen Jones, for example, not putting on a hair shirt or running naked down the street or eating his hat in order as some kind of mea culpa for his stupidity on Venezuela, given what's happening to it now? Why do they never apologise?
Mostly because he gets away with it. He can. So why should he? It would be very
honesty, moral integrity.
Yeah, ideally, but you can't count on that.
But are you saying that the left I mean, this is what I'm getting around to. Are you saying that the left has no moral integrity?
If they have, it would be overpowered by other things. It's very emotionally uncomfortable to admit to yourself, I have been colossally wrong about this, and I have some serious soul-searching to do. Maybe my whole ideas are wrong. It would be one thing to say, right, I didn't think this through. I didn't know that much about Venezuela. That would be one of the easier ways to get out. That would be a way of saying, yes, I was wrong, and now let's move on. But that's not the way they do it. They most leftists around 2013 just stopped talking about Venezuela at all. And now there's this sort of backtracking going on where they say, oh, come on, you're just saying this because you want to smear Jeremy Corbyn. And why are you guys so obsessed with Venezuela? Which, of course, the irony is, I was never interested in Venezuela. It was the left who were banging on about it all the time. They wouldn't shut up about it as long as oil prices were sky high and as long as Venezuela seemed to be doing relatively well.
Yes, that is such a good point. That and also there was that game they played. Remember where they were going? Never mind Venezuela. Look at Saudi Arabia, as though somehow all conservatives had been championing Saudi Arabia, and so there was fault on both sides.
Yeah, you could, of course, make the case. You can make a very good case criticizing the government's attitudes or approach to Saudi Arabia. You could say they should take a tougher line and all that. But whatever you make of that, this would be at worst a case of cowardly realpolitik.
Yes.
It would be that they're cozying up to them because it's just easier for them that way. But nobody has ever said Saudi Arabia is an inspiration to the world. Owen Jones did say Venezuela is an inspiration to the world. Nobody ever said Saudi Arabia has shown us that there is a better way of doing things. Corbyn did say precisely that, literally, about Venezuela.
Yeah.
Saying Chavez has shown us that there is a different and a better way of doing things. It's called socialism.
I don't know whether you ever saw the exchange of correspondence in The Spectator concerning James Bartholomew.
Yes, I've seen it.
Who's one of us. He's a libertarian, and he was exasperated to discover that his beloved godson, who's presumably of university age, was a big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, and there were various letters written by young people in the letters section, justifying petulantly, I thought, justifying why they voted Jeremy Corbyn, and it was all about their sense of justice, or rather their sense of an injustice in society right now, which is that the baby boomer generation has it all and they want a piece of what the boomers have. They want free education like I had when I was at university. They want to be able to buy houses just like the boomer generation had. How do you go about speaking to these petulant young people with this sense of kind of entitlement?
On the latter case, I think they even have a point. There is a minor economic component to Corbyn mania. It's mainly a cultural phenomenon, I'd say. It's mostly that Corbyn is popular in the same way that, say, a club in Dalston would be popular. It's trendy and considered hip and cool, and that's what Corbyn mania is. It's not so much about economics, but it's more a form of hipsterism. He may be popular in the way in which a craft beer brewery is popular.
Yes, he is, or a micro
yeah,
pub.
it has to be a micro. But there is also a bit of an economic component, which is that there are people who, say, have graduated, who've got a job, who are doing the right thing, and they notice that their living standards aren't improving, that housing costs are eating up most of their income, and they extrapolate from that experience saying there's something fundamentally wrong with the system, which there isn't. This is a specific problem of one sector of the economy, which is the housing market, and it's got nothing to do with capitalism or socialism or third way or anything else. It's something that requires a much more pragmatic solution, which is just to build a lot more houses. And the reason why that hasn't happened has nothing to do with any ideology or the system we live in. It's just that successive governments have been too cowardly to confront the opposition to house building that you always get when somebody wants to build something. You get the NIMBY groups, the Not in My Backyard groups coming out protesting against it. And politicians try to appease those groups and reject every planning application. If you do that for several decades in a row, then you get a serious shortage of housing.
It's interesting.
Young people are then angry about that. And if somebody tells them, oh no, this isn't just some minor problem in this sector, this is something that's fundamentally wrong with the economy, this is neoliberalism screwing you, I guess that sounds superficially persuasive.
Yeah, I want to address this is a fixation that a lot of the young kind of libertarian types of your ilk have, which is that you and people like Sam Bowman basically want to build bloody everywhere, and I'll pick you up on that in a moment. Is not the more fundamental problem with those two issues? Number one, free university fees. It was just about tenable for the state, i.e. the taxpayer, to subsidise university education for an elite. And I think we do need an educated elite. In the days when I was at university, when probably about 10% of my generation went to university. But then Tony Blair came along and said, yeah, we need more graduates for our graduate economy. And so upped the number of people going to university to the percentage to about 50%. So suddenly we had 50% of the youth going to read windsurfing and My Little Pony studies at the University of Greater England, formerly, I don't know, Bath Polytechnic, and coming out with this expectation of a graduate-style job and ending up flipping burgers at McDonald's. That's number one problem. And then the housing problem surely has more to do with QE, with the asset price inflation created by government policy engineered to try and create inflation to enable them to carry on government spending. I mean, isn't that the real problem?
Okay, that's two things. I think you're absolutely right on the first point. There is over-education. That's why a lot of graduates are in non-graduate jobs, even years after they're finished at university. There is only a limited demand for graduate jobs. And if you're over-educating people, if you encourage too many people to go into university, yes, then they will come out with that degree and the expectation that they will find a graduate job. And if they don't, that creates frustration and bitterness. And in that sense, you could even make a very unprogressive case for against tuition fees. You could say, if the government has to finance higher education, what would it do? It would try to keep the number of places down. It would ration it. And if you want few people to go to university, if you want it to be only for the elite, maybe that would be what you want. I'm not saying that's my solution, but it's a reasonable case that you can make.
Yeah, absolutely. But are
Have
you
it tightly rationed?
Are you going to disagree with me on QE? Surely that's one of the problems that we have.
It is
inflated.
It is absolutely, yes. But the housing problem started well before then. So at least from the 70s onwards, house prices have been going up relative to incomes. Started taking off in the mid 90s, well before QE, and also QE shouldn't inflate rents. It should make buying a house more expensive relative to renting, and that is happening to some extent. But rents are also going through the roof.
Yes, no, I think that's a perfectly reasonable point. Yes, but I agree that more housing needs to be built. But surely, I used to read 2000 AD. I'm a fan of Judge Dredd. I'm a fan of megacities. I know that most people want to live in the city. They don't want to live in the country. And I think the country should be a separate thing. The country should be the rural idyll. And the thing I get, the vibe I get from you kids, I mean, I don't know how old you are. I consider you a kid.
37.
Yeah, exactly. You've got long curly hair. You're a child. A sweet child.
Thanks.
But what you don't seem to appreciate, because you're so metropolitan and urban and sophisticated, is that there is something very special about the English, Welsh, Scottish countryside, and what we don't want is the kind of disaster that they've had in Ireland, which is a kind of planning free-for-all where people put up white boxes here and there and completely destroy the rural characteristic of the countryside. So I wonder whether we actually do want that much more rural building. I think it's fine having urban building and probably upwards.
You can do a bit of both. You could build around the commuter stations in outer London. A lot of that is not bucolic.
I'm with you there.
Rural
Blood.
idylls. But the trouble is, even that would be greenbelt. That's the trouble with the label greenbelt, that people imagine the kind of landscapes that you've just described, where I think pretty much anyone would be in favor of preserving them. But Greenbelt is an extremely crude destination. It's got nothing to do with the characteristics of that landscape. It's just that in the 50s, a bunch of town planners, bureaucrats, took a map, drew circles around some of the bigger cities, and said, right, let's call this Greenbelt. And at some point, it became sacrosanct and couldn't be challenged anymore. A lot of that is crap land. If you take a train to any...
I like that phrase. Is that a technical term, crap land?
That's what...
Crappen land. What would be the German phrase for that?
Oh, that's a good question. This
Crappenland.
time there is no German word for that. I'll come
What a
up with
shame.
one in due course.
Yeah, okay.
That could be because there isn't that much of crapland over there, because they don't have green belts. If it is crappy land, they would build on it. But they would, of course, also protect
Germany
forests.
is much less dense, isn't it, in terms
No,
of population?
That's not true. Population density is almost the same as here.
Is it really?
Yes.
But Germany, how many times bigger than Britain is Germany in terms of land?
That I don't know. I've just looked at the density figures, and they're almost the same. But density figures for the country as a whole don't tell you much.
No.
The figures for Sweden and Norway then would be close to zero, but that's simply because the whole of the north of those countries is empty. You need to look at density in the parts of the country where people want to live.
Yes.
So density for the southeast, and in that regard, a region like North Rhine-Westphalia, which is around Cologne, has a much higher population density figure than the southeast of England. But nonetheless, they don't have a housing problem. They build, and they still have beautiful countryside.
Right.
So absolutely not, no conflict there. But if you take a train to one of the airports around London, you will see, part of it is rolling hills, lovely stuff that should be preserved. But you will also see a lot of the scrubland, muddy fields. a lot of it can only be cultivated because of subsidies, agricultural subsidies and protectionism, which ideally in the course of Brexit you would get rid of anyway. So cut some of those useless agricultural subsidies, import more food from New Zealand or wherever, and if that frees up unspectacular land for housing in the Greenbelt, then build on it.
Yes.
A lot of it isn't even accessible to the public anyway. It would be closed off. If it's farmland, you can't just walk through it.
Yeah.
So go for those bits.
Do you know what? I think that's quite a reasonable answer. I'm not thinking this stupid evil German wants to tread with his jackboots all over my beautiful countryside. Because actually, there is something. Do the Germans have a similar thing about their countryside still, or not really?
Absolutely, yes. But it's a bit of a more selective definition of countryside, I would say. So people wouldn't go mental if somebody wanted to build on the fringe of a town or a village on some muddy field. But if you try to build somewhere in an area of woodland, then I guess you would get resistance. Just that doesn't happen. You wouldn't get an application for those places anyway.
That's because basically what were the Germans, the Goths, and the who were the ones that defeated the Arminius? Who was Arminius in the Teutoburg forest when you killed the Romans? Yeah.
No idea.
No, but you Germans,
some coalition of tribes.
You love your forest, don't you? You're really into your deep, dark forests, and you think about all the fairy tales and stuff. Whereas we in England like our parkland and our open, so that we can go fox hunting across it, which you, I believe, banned banned hunting in Germany in the 1930s. I think certain leader.
Don't know. It was whether that was ever a thing, fox hunting.
No, probably wasn't. But I suspect you have a slightly different understanding of your landscape than we have of ours, and I want our rural idyls preserved despite my libertarian instincts. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and quite German guest, Kristian Niemitz.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Kristian Niemitz. I'm really enjoying having Kristian on the show because even though he's German, and you can tell by his slight German accent, he is comfortable talking about both British and German issues. I mean, he's pretty well integrated, I would say, aren't you, Kristian?
I suppose so. Wasn't too difficult. The beer took a while. I wasn't a massive fan of the ales in the beginning.
Well, you know,
took some getting used to. I am now. I'm now a member of the campaign for real ale.
Are you really?
But yeah, it is a bit of an acquired taste. I never had a problem with them. Always thought they were quite good, but it didn't really click in the beginning.
Because German beer, I suppose, is basically lager, isn't it?
Yes.
Or Weiss beer.
Yeah, Weizen could be, or some darker ones, but ale of the kind that you get here, normally not, no.
Right.
Although they overlap a bit. So a very hoppy pils could be almost indistinguishable from an English ale.
I think that we English and you Germans British actually, have a lot more in common than we do with, say, our ancient enemies, the French. I mean, I kind of love-hate the French, but I've always got on really well with Germans. I think we have we pretend that, you know, because of the small incident in those two wars I mentioned, we pretend that we hate each other, but I'm not sure we do actually.
No, there were those two little faux pas that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But no, on the whole, everyday life isn't very different here. I say even the sense of humor, the most often quoted thing, is pretty much the same.
Although don't Germans go in for more sort of bottom jokes and sort of shit jokes. It's like Arschloch and Lech mich am Arsch and things like that.
Yeah, well, those are
Scatological.
old words. They come from a different era. I haven't looked up the etymology of that.
Well,
the
Lech mich am
origin,
Arsch
but
was Goethe, I think, wasn't it?
I've no idea.
Yeah. Anyway, but yes, I think you're right. I think we do have a similar sense of humour, and I think it's a calumny that the Germans are completely humourless, jackbooted bastards. I think you're all right. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you was about a very interesting tweet that you tweeted the other day, where you said something like, "We need a new." Can you remember what it said?
About what?
Where you said we need a new word for the kind of person who pretends to be a conservative and then advances left-wing causes.
Yeah, that there should be a German word for that type of person, somebody who is notionally on the right, but who spends most of his waking hours talking lefty drivel and making a career out of that.
Which in America, for example, one thinks of David L. Brooks, who pretends to be a conservative, yet writes about liberal matters for the New York Times all the time and is constantly selling his side down the river. In fact, there are so many examples, aren't there?
Nick Timothy is the main example at the moment with
Nick Timothy.
Telegraph.
Nick Timothy, who for those who aren't familiar with the British politics, Nick Timothy was the guy with the beard who somehow managed to hijack the entire Conservative administration by becoming special advisor to Theresa May, who was formerly thought to be the coming thing, and who was going to be expected to be in power for ages. With Nick Timothy advising her, and he and his ghastly, who was that ghastly woman who was with him?
I know who you mean, don't remember the name.
No, some ghastly Scottish woman. They were the kind of people who guarded Theresa May jealously and prevented access to her from any one of a conservative disposition. And they wrote, or rather Timothy, I think, wrote the Conservative Manifesto, which all but lost Theresa May the last election. I mean, did you read that manifesto?
Parts of it, the worst parts of it, presumably the ones written by Nick Timothy, because they read exactly like his Telegraph column, where he says, we, the Conservatives, we reject the cult of selfish individualism and loads of broadsides against Thatcherites, free marketeers, against that wing of the party. Problem I have with that is, look, this isn't about ideological purity. I don't think we should ever imitate the factionalism and sectarianism of the left, that we constantly look out for traitors and tell someone, unless you're totally ideologically pure, you're a deserter or something. It's more that what these people do is they attack a lot of straw men, and that shows you they're not really interested in finding a compromise or moderating their own side to some extent. They're mostly interested in virtue signaling. Otherwise, why would you attack a position that actually nobody really holds? The cult of selfish individualism, who preaches that? Maybe Randians, maybe followers of Ayn Rand, but how many of them are there in this country? Is it? Yeah. Exactly.
It's true. Whenever I hear a conservative talking about selfish individualism, I hear somebody who doesn't really understand conservatism, who doesn't understand the invisible hand, who doesn't understand free markets, who doesn't understand anything really.
Yeah, they come up with relatively trivial stuff, saying, look, we've got the economy more or less right, but we also need to worry about social cohesion, about community, about family, and so forth. Yeah, right, but who is against that?
Because conservatives really don't care about a happy society, and they don't. What they want is perpetual rebellion from the poor against the rich, and what they really want is divided families. Not.
It is, of course, true that an institute like the IA, we wouldn't normally write a lot about community and family and friendship and stuff, but that's simply because why do you read our material? Because you think that we know something about economics. On the value of family life, social life, I don't know more than the next guy. So that there's no reason why you would read a Kristian Niemitz column on why community is important.
I sometimes think, in fact, this is a philosophy I've been developing recently, that real life, the life that's valuable, the life that most people care about, is the life that exists outside the political sphere. I was thinking about this. Tomorrow I've got to go on to or Sunday I've got to go on some BBC programme to talk about the hospital in Shropshire, which rejected a £2,500 donation to the hospital from these medical students because the head of the hospital trust had taken offence at the fact that these men had dressed in drag and that this was demeaning to women. And I was thinking, what kind of miserable killjoy person could you be to stop medical students dressing up in drag, raising money, having fun, people voluntarily giving their money to the hospital, only to be stymied by this weird left-wing ideologue?
It just sounds like almost like those guidelines that some universities were issuing about Halloween costumes, which ones are offensive.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And this is where most people, I think, are just not on that page. They're not looking to take offence all the time. They're not. They just want to be. They want to raise their families, make a living, improve their living standards. Just be left alone.
But that's the reason why this happens. This sort of offense taking is a form of status signaling. It's a way to set yourself apart from others. And if you want to do that, you have to pick something unusual. Because otherwise, if there is something that could be considered genuinely offensive, then a lot of people would agree with you. But then you're not setting yourself apart. If you want to show that you have special moral sensitivities, you need to pick a case where there's just nothing really wrong with the situation. Something like statues that normally most people just walk past and don't think about who that is, what that person has done.
Well, your colleague Jamie White, who we bumped into before this podcast, was saying something similar. He was saying that a friend of his in New Zealand said that the fact that the left is now looking into the past and looking for tiny niggling details of things to be offended by is proof that really all the important battles have been fought and won, that we are, to all intents and purposes, social justice already reigns. And it's because it's the trivia that they're looking for now, which indicates the big subjects are like beyond discussion now.
Yeah, it is about discovering new offences. That's why they come up with new offences all the time. That's something, or there's some type of food or some way of dressing is now cultural appropriation. But that is precisely because on most issues they have already won. And if you use those PC opinions as a way of setting yourself apart from others, then you need to find something new once most of your positions have gone mainstream. It's a bit like with the various waves of counterculture in music that you had the hippies and then the punks and then grunge in the 1990s, that as soon as one of those countercultures becomes the new mainstream culture, the people who consider themselves edgy need to find a different way of being ahead of the curve.
I've noticed this watching University Challenge, that for 2 years running, the Warwick team has had somebody who clearly identifies as transgender. So this week they've got a man with long hair who calls himself Flora. And I'm thinking, this is not really about gender. This is about establishing your difference and pissing off the older generation, which it does, by the way. It really pisses me off. I want Warwick to lose big time. I don't want them getting anywhere near the final. Because, like, why? Why are they taking an issue which is... Well, actually, no, I'm not going to go to transgender, because actually I've sidetracked myself and you from what I wanted to talk about in this section, which is the ineffable annoyingness of people like Tim Montgomery. Tim Montgomery, who calls himself a conservative, and yet is constantly advocating for things which I don't think are conservatism. He's constantly apologising for conservatism and persuading rich backers to fund him into the... He's got a new website called Unheard, which is obviously lavishly funded, and yet...
And well heard of.
Yeah.
The ideas, at least.
Yeah. Well, tiresomely overheard ideas, apologising for conservatism. These people are a bit like... It's a bit like if in 1939, sorry to bring up the war again, if a certain faction within the British establishment said, look, We recognise that Hitler is a complete bastard, but we really do think we ought to be supplying a bit of ammunition to the Germans and maybe some of our technology and maybe a few of our men, because otherwise it's just unfair. Why do they do this?
They hope that they seem to be moving mainly in lefty circles and desperately crave the approval of their left-wing friends. They have internalized some of the guilt. They have accepted the idea that the left is essentially morally superior, and that their side is maybe a bit better in economics, maybe a bit better at running things, but that essentially, are we the baddies? I think so.
It is. It's like that sketch, isn't it?
Yes.
Are we the bad guys? But how thick have you got to be to think that? I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't know where Monty went to university, and actually, mind you, having had a good education is not necessarily a good guide, is it? Because you think about the number of people at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale who think complete shit. I mean, really have no intellectual rigour at all. They can't look at it. But do you know what? In a way, this podcast series that I do is really an endless quest to answer the question: how can the left be so fucking stupid? Why do they deny the evidence? Why do they deny the obvious, which is that conservatism doesn't need to apologise for itself, and that the moral atrocities are committed far more often by the left than the right? Why can they not see that they are destroying a philosophy which is an ideology which is good and noble, and why do they undermine it?
Don't know specifically about conservatism, but definitely when it goes against libertarianism and free market ideas. We talked about this book here earlier, Why We Bite the Invisible Hand, The Psychology of Anti-Capitalism. Which,
so recommended. Peter Foster. Really good, underrated book.
Argues that essentially anti-capitalism is hardwired into our brains, that anti-capitalism feels right instinctively. Our minds have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in gatherings of hunter-gatherer tribes in those kinds of surroundings, when people hunted together, when all economic activity was done by a small group. It was all collective. It was purposeful, where the division of the spoils afterwards, where that was a political decision. And there's something in us, in our brains, that wants to extrapolate from that small tribe to a large anonymous society.
P.J. O'Rourke once wrote an essay on this subject, probably several actually, that one of the delusions of the left is that there is only one pizza pie, and that if you cut off a portion of that pizza pie into giving it to somebody, that is somebody else's loss. This is the fundamental delusion of the left, and it's the same with Peter Foster's theory about the hunter-gatherers.
It's part of it, yes. But that's because for hundreds of thousands of years that was true. You had caught a mammoth or whatever. And
there was only one mammoth to go round.
That was it.
Yes, exactly. You can't expand the mammoth population. They never farmed mammoths, I don't think. Whereas we've
in
evolved
the wild, you cannot. Supply doesn't respond to demand. Just because you have more mouths to feed, nature doesn't supply you with more stuff to eat. So therefore, the world was a zero-sum game for most of the time.
But I suppose what really upsets me is, why are people like you and me in the minority? Why do donors give money to bloody Tim Montgomery and not to me?
I suppose it has to do with...
Another one, Bright Blue. Bright Blue. I mean, I'm going to say fucking Bright Blue, which is a think tank, which is like almost like the anti-IEA, isn't it? But it's the opposite of IEA's intellectual rigour. It's about this version of conservatism, which is, we're kind of the bad guys. We know we're bad, but here's a way of making us nicer by behaving like socialists.
It might work for some of them, even. I guess is...
What, in their tummies? It might make them feel warm and gooey.
More that they get positive social feedback.
Yes.
So... Otherwise, why would you give a column to Nick Timothy?
It's good question. Why would you?
He's such a profound thinker. It's just that we have this idea that if somebody is technically in political camp X, but says something that you would associate with the other side or one of the other sides, that we automatically think, wow, that person must have some profound insights. Which it doesn't. Of course, I could write an article saying why Nicolas Maduro is a brilliant chap and why we should be like Venezuela. It would be counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect that coming from me, but it would still be rubbish.
Yes. It's funny. I happen to know the proprietors of two very much out conservative publications. Both of these proprietors, without naming names, are incredibly rich. They've got incredibly rich off the back of their conservative publications. But I know that even though they're making money out of being very conservative, and that probably their brain tells them that they're doing the right thing, they're not just doing it to make money, that they believe in the cause. At the same time, I know that they get tremendous shit from all their contemporaries, because rich people move in rich people's circles. And every dinner party they go to, they get given shit by rich liberals for being conservative. And I think it wears them down. I think it's very, very hard for those of us who've chosen the difficult path, who've taken the red pill. We know that although we get the reward of knowing that we're right, and being able to speak from first principles and to speak honestly about everything and to be intellectually pure, we nevertheless recognise that there's a terrible price to pay for that, which is that we get given shit and we get thought of as evil by half the world.
Yeah, well, I'm not particularly bothered by that. You just accept at some point
German,
that
you're hardcore.
well,
mate.
you see,
Yeah,
and you just accept at some point that your views will never make you popular. That if you want to be popular, you have to do that in other ways.
Have you got a wife, girlfriend?
Yes,
Wife. And how does she feel about where you are? Was she the same?
As far as I can see, yeah, she mostly agrees.
But
so no problem there.
Do you find yourself being discriminated against or having life difficult because of your conservatism?
Libertarianism.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you're pretty much where I am actually.
Yeah.
Conservatarian, maybe.
Not particularly. No, it's you would when I'm somewhere, say at a dinner party or somewhere with people I don't know. It is of course the case that if there's the Corbynista at the table who bangs on about how St. Jeremy should be in charge, and I say something against that, then instinctively the reactions around the table would, if it's a randomly gathered audience, not selected ideologically, then the sympathies would be with that other person. Those are the more high status views. So then I'd have a tougher time.
So there you are.
I know that before. So.
Yeah. Also,
in a situation where I don't want that kind of stuff, I would shut up about politics, if only for an hour.
Also, like me when I was a bit younger, you can pass yourself off as I used to have shoulder length hair. I used to be a rock critic, and people didn't know what my politics were, and I think it spared me a lot of grief. Whereas now I look at all my friends from my past, and I've lost so many because of my politics, and I'm thinking, I don't mind you being a lefty twat. I don't mind that you can't think clearly. I accept that that's the way the world is, but you judge me on my politics.
Yeah, can be annoying.
Yeah, it is
happened,
annoying.
but
well, Kristian, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you didn't mind my mentioning Zavor a few times. And I meant
too much.
I meant what I said about you being commanding one of my panzer divisions, and I hope you take that well.
We'll see.
No, I think you'd be bloody good at it. I can imagine you rolling across the steps with
Maybe there will
the
be
wind in
opportunity
your
at
long
some point.
hair. Yeah, maybe, mate. We could be in the same.
We lead the resistance.
Yeah, exactly. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and quite German guest, Kristian Niemitz. Thank you and goodbye.